Okay. So we'll just give everyone a little bit of time. People are trickling in. Hi to everyone who's here. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Just want to give everyone some time to log in. And if you guys want to introduce yourselves in the chat and say where you're coming from, that would also be really great. We definitely want to make this as interactive as possible. So please go ahead and introduce yourselves. Okay, wonderful. So hi again, welcome everybody. We are so excited to have you guys here with us today. My name is Niara Valério. I am one of the people who are part of the Community Conversations Harlem. Before we get started, we'll just tell you guys a little bit about ourselves and why we started this. Essentially, you know, we're a group of Harlem residents who live here, and we're obviously very passionate about our community. And we really wanted to bring conversations that were happening at a national level, very locally down to Harlem, to just start dialogue, you know, initiate conversations about things that effective change within our own community, right? So there is obviously a lot of national conversation around abolition and police brutality, and we sort of wanted to ground it and bring it back to our community to think about what would these conversations look like within Harlem specifically. So, you know, the purpose of this is really to be as community and as dialogue focused. You know, I will introduce Kristin in a minute, but I want to make sure that, you know, everyone feels that they have, you know, complete agency to ask questions and to participate as much as they can, because that's really the goal of this. Before we get started, I will say that we are recording this session. What we will do is we will record when Kristin and I are speaking, and we'll remove the recording for the question portion of it, so you guys can feel comfortable asking questions without feeling the pressure of being recorded. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Kristin. So thank you so much for being here. Kristin Richardson Jordan is a Black, queer, third-generation Harlemite running for New York City Council, representing District 9 Harlem. She advocates for full employment, free quality education, free public transportation, and prison abolition. Her Disrupt the District campaign includes measures to defund the NYPD and Department of Corrections, improve police accountability, and close Rikers by 2027 without opening new jails. So Kristin, welcome. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me. I feel totally honored to be here, and I'm excited for this and for other conversations that the group is going to have. And yeah, I get to be first guest speaker.
Yes. Thank you. So we're really excited to have you. You know, and I think that this is going to be a really great conversation, because I think so many people have a lot of really big questions around abolition. And so that your platform addresses that directly. So I think it'll be really great. I guess to start out, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what it was like growing up in Harlem? And I guess more specifically, how has your experience growing up in Harlem impacted your activism?
Yeah, definitely. So I will say, well, you said in my bio, I'm third generation Harlem. So I will say that for me, Harlem community is close to my heart, and it's been a huge part of my lived experience. Growing up, I was very close to my great aunt, who actually was an original tenant here at Lenox Terrace, which is where I live now. And so that was like family's sort of first generation of Harlem, was my great aunt on my mom's side and actually my grandparents on my dad's side. But I had a particular closeness with my great aunt because she was very politically minded. Now, granted, I strayed from some of her politics. She had a very traditional sort of moderate Democratic politics. She was in a Democratic club. It was, very typical. But she did help organize some of that Democratic club to go to the March on Washington, which was pretty cool. And I got to, hear stories about that and things like that just growing up. And so from high school on, I had this interest in some sort of community service and civic engagement and connection to Harlem community, and was always doing something. I grew up in a family where we just believed in doing something. You gave back. You were part of the community. It was not just all about you. You have a social responsibility to the rest of your Harlem family, and really to humanity, like to the world. And when I went to college, as is the way, as we are supposed to do, I got challenged with new and cool and creative and radical ideas. I decided to do Black studies. And when I did that, I learned even more about my history and heritage and culture than I had learned before from parents and grandparents. But what I learned in school had a real radical lens, and I really became quite radicalized. It was in college that I found my way to democratic socialism as a economic philosophy, and politically found my way to Afrocentricity and Black liberation. And and what's interesting is, as I adopted those ideals, I actually got less interested in electoral politics, right? Because I generally crossed off the electoral as the realm for those who are sellouts and not particularly interested in real community and real liberation. And I pretty much wrote it off until fairly recently, when I got inspired by seeing the change in Congress, the new Congress, and seeing the squad and seeing, okay, so we have AOC, who we all know, but also Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley, and we're seeing these powerful women of color running for office on radical ideas and winning. And that just inspired me to say, that's actually possible.
Yeah.
And that's what drew me back into sort of a electoral politics arena.
Mhm.
But I was, even before that time, very active in terms of police accountability. And I was an abolitionist for really like quite some years, since college. And I founded this Harlem Cop Watch team where we focused on videoing police activity and just finding ways to hold police accountable. And what I found, to be perfectly honest, is that we have the civilian complaint review boards, right, which is supposed to be the way of holding police accountable. But
Yeah.
these civilian complaint review boards don't have any actual power. They can't fire or suspend police officers. They're also not elected from the community, they're appointed.
Yeah.
So what we have, point of fact, is a figurehead more than anything else. We don't actually have real police accountability. And when it came to that, and that's such an issue that I'm so passionate about. It's such an issue in this community in particular, because Central Harlem has extremely high incarceration rates, extremely high policing and presence of police, and more so than other parts of the city. And so I was very motivated to do something about that. And it come to find out the place to do something about that is City Council.
Yes.
Right? Like that's where you can actually make some policy and put some things in place for real community control of local policing.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm actually glad that you brought that up. I think it's very interesting because when you're looking at your campaign, I mean, you're talking about your background and your experience, and it's so apparent when you're looking at your campaign and the things that you stand for, which I think is really incredible. And so I wanted to sort of dive into that a little bit. You mentioned the police accountability piece. I know that your campaign, right, it spells out Harlem, and the H is, of course, for holding the police accountable. And so I guess what I wanted to ask was, what progress has been made so far in that round? And what are some actionable steps that we can take to actually, not only hold police accountable, but also if we're thinking about the topic of abolition, like what are some concrete steps that we can take to get there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I do want to say I do identify openly as an abolitionist. I talk very openly about that. So it's not just the civilian complaint review boards, and it's not just reforming that, though I do want to do that. I think that's good reform. But I do ultimately believe in a world without police and a world without jails. I do ultimately believe in defunding NYPD down to zero. And I speak openly about that, and instead funding alternatives to policing and alternatives to incarceration. I think now is the time for really bold, creative ideas. That's one of the things I've been most excited about, is seeing the possibilities for that. I think we have to really consider what's going on in the neighborhood with these different things that we call crime and that we call police for. So the first thing is we need to examine what is actually crime, because we have at this moment criminalized huge segments of the population for things that should not be criminal. There are a lot of quality of life crimes and crimes of poverty where we are vilifying the homeless, where we're criminalizing those who are differently abled or who have mental or emotional. And we're also criminalizing a series of things that need not be criminal, including some of the drug use. So I think we need to first figure out, how do we define these things that are crime, and how do we redefine it, right? And then the magical question that everyone asks when you're an abolitionist is, what are you going to do about violent crime or violence in the community?
Yes, of course.
So the first thing I like to say is that that's a small fraction of what we're actually talking about. So that's the first thing we need to really see and hear and understand, that the vast majority of police activity is not about addressing violent crime. The vast majority of police activity and the vast majority of what's happening in terms of incarceration is nonviolent offenses that have been criminalized. That being said, in terms of addressing violent crime, I think we can start with preemptive action. We start with education. We do tools for de-escalation. And we also get in the habit of relying on systems and things other than the police. Mm-hmm. So what can we do to empower mental health street teams? What can we do to empower de-escalation teams? Where do we set up restorative and transformational justice models? Where do we set up places where we can interrupt violence? And then we're actually dealing with the problem, because part of what we have to realize is that by policing the situation, we have not dealt with the problem. We've simply taken this violent action and then added more violence to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's exactly it. I think when there is so much conversation around abolition, and I think in so many ways it makes people very uncomfortable for a variety of reasons, because they can't really, it's very difficult to envision something that doesn't quite exist yet, right? And I think for so many people that I've spoken with, you know, what makes them so passionate about abolition in particular is that you're essentially re-envisioning a future that doesn't exist, but you're creating that sort of ideal vision, right? And you want to completely rethink these models that have traditionally been extremely oppressive. So I'm glad that you brought this up. I guess if we were to bring it down, you know, locally to Harlem, right? Say maybe like 20 years, etc. for now, you know, but very, very long term, or maybe we can even talk about short term. What are some actionable steps that as a community we can take? And then more long term, you know, what might that look like?
I think one thing we could do right off the bat and short term is drop the count. I think that politically, we are in a place right now where something like that is finally possible, and I'm excited for it. I think the actual presence of police officers, the actual number of cops on our streets, whether they are currently taking action or not, is a form of violence, that sort of over-policing presence. And so I think one of the things that we were calling for with the defund movement, which I was a part of, was we were calling for that dropping of the count. And unfortunately, what happened with this last budget was some smoke and mirrors. We're going to shuffle the money around. We're going to do it through the schools. It actually winds up criminalizing our kids. And we haven't done anything to actually change the nature of policing under this new budget.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's one of the things we could do, is push for a budget that actually defunds NYPD and actually leads to a decrease in the head count itself, into the number of police officers itself. Another thing I think we can do just as community members and activists and people who live here is make sure we are cop watching. You know, like I said before, I founded a Harlem Cop Watch team. I am personally an avid cop watcher, and I believe that that is something important, and I do find it to be our social responsibility. I do understand that there is a push and effort to, you know, have officers have their own cameras. I think we have to be clear that that is not police accountability. Having police have their own camera that they could control, manipulate, footage is lost, footage is going to other police, is not the same as community accountability. And it definitely doesn't help us in moving towards abolition. So I think what we need to do is cop watch more. And I also think what we can do, again, just as activists and community members, is increase models of community care and think about alternatives to policing and incarceration. There is, I forgot who put it out, but there's a great meme going around, and I'll see if maybe I could send it to you, but it was like places you could call other than police, right? So thinking about even just us as people who live in Harlem, who are from Harlem, or even, I've said this before, even if you're not from Harlem, you know, like I'm third generation, but if you're not, that's fine. It's seriously namaste and welcome and all of that. But what I also say is don't come mess it up. Don't come here and mess it up,
Yeah.
right? And there is a legacy of Black freedom fighting and heritage and pride here. I unfortunately don't think we've seen much of that in the political arena in terms of elections and the electoral arena, but we have seen that in terms of a lot of Black freedom movements that have their roots and their history and even currently exist in Harlem. The Black Women's March that I was at was organized by some young Harlemites. So literally Black Lives Matter movement coming right out of Harlem with some powerful change agents.
Yeah.
So we definitely have that here, and I just want to see that happen in terms of electoral space, and I want that to be our representation. And when I looked around and didn't see it and couldn't find it, I decided to run for office so we could have that. Because I think Harlem deserves that. Harlem deserves to have somebody who is, you know, a democratic socialist, abolitionist, Black freedom fighter who is representing the community, because that's actually what's in service to us.
Right. No, I agree. And that, we were having this conversation earlier that now it's, now that this conversation is happening, it's really kind of like the opportune time to be able to, think about what this would look like in Harlem specifically, right? So all these things are happening nationally that I think are just very, very critical to within our own communities even. I have a couple of questions. I think just one thing that I sort of wanted to just generally put out there, the community model of justice, right? As you were talking about that, I think that so much of abolition and the conversations that we've heard, a lot of it comes down to thinking about alternative forms of policing. And the fact that you brought up much of the time when the police are called, it's not necessarily for violent crimes, right? It's mental health situations. And, do we necessarily believe that the police have the skills or the capacity to handle a situation like that? So, in an instance, right, just say someone in an idealized Harlem, right? If we were to implement this, what could that potentially look like in terms of community models of justice, like organizations, would it be individuals? Like how can we sort of envision that happening on an everyday basis?
So, so there are two things I gotta say around that. So one, I think we could vision, the absolute future, and this is sort of the long term, right? And this is what I've said about abolition, that abolition is the long game. Mm-hmm. So what we envision is a nonviolent world, mm-hmm. not necessarily a utopian, right, but nonviolent in the sense that people have been armed and equipped with tools in order to de-escalate violence. And so it would mean education, it would mean resources, it would actually mean, I have 7 points to my Harlem platform. It would actually mean all of those things, because we would need to have affordable housing. We would need to have investment in local, especially Black-owned businesses. We would need to have senior care. We would need to have all the other pieces of functioning, beautiful, like supportive society in order to de-escalate the violence. And what I hate is that I think abolition sometimes gets a bad rap of it being, these white dudes who are like gun-ho, spray painting everywhere. And that somehow it's a call for this like unfettered violence in the streets. But really, the abolitionist view that I hold is rooted in reading a lot of Black feminists like Angela Davis, and it's rooted in my own faith of like Christianity and Buddhism, where it's actually this call for nonviolence. Mm-hmm. It's actually the total opposite of violence. It's the call for a nonviolent community and also a nonviolent state. And what we have to realize is that some of us have been privileged to be taught tools of communication and taught tools of de-escalation and given resources to walk away. Yeah. And given resources to be strong and have self-esteem and have a sense of worth and been shown love. And then there are many in our society who have not. And so part of the long view I hold is like, imagine a world where everyone got basic needs met. Yeah. And how that would already eliminate so much of the violence. Mm-hmm. Then add to that, imagine a world where everyone received healthcare, including mental health care. Yeah. That would then eliminate the violence. Yeah. So that's the long-term vision, is that we would actually operate so differently from the way we are now, that there would be such a prevention on violence that we wouldn't even need these things that we right now think are necessary, like calling cops or even, that being said, the vision of the transition I have would be to call counselors, right? More counselors, more social workers, more therapists, more Black healers, spiritual leaders, and less cops.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and you know, there are very actionable steps that we can take in the immediate.
Yeah.
And you know, there is this very long-term vision, but even bring it down to the very present, like even that budget meeting that happened a couple of weeks ago and the frustration with that budget meeting. You know, I don't know if anybody else was watching it, but it was honestly just the most incredibly frustrating thing, knowing that there had been so much conversation happening right outside City Hall, right? And it was, the vote is still very decisive, as you mentioned, smoke and mirrors. So I think another thing that I wanted to sort of touch upon is, I know one of your platforms is to close Rikers by 2027 without opening any new prisons. So what are, you know, it's a very ambitious and very exciting plan. What are some of the current barriers right now to closing Rikers? I think that people are aware of the conversation that's happening around it and that there have been pushes to close Rikers, but concretely, what is happening right now that makes it so difficult to do that?
Well, so honestly, I think it's our mentality and a lack of political will more than anything else. I think that the actual population, so here's the first thing to understand, is that Rikers is not at capacity. So the actual population that is in Rikers is not like, it's not full. Then if on top of that, if we then take a look at, okay, well, who is there pre-trial? And there's a huge segment of people who are there pre-trial. This means that they are actually innocent in terms of our system. They have not gone to court. They have not been found guilty. They're actually in Rikers simply because they don't have the means to leave Rikers. So this is part of my argument for eliminating bail, and that we need to make sure we do that and decriminalize some of these crimes of poverty. So once we eliminate those who are there for nonviolent drug offenses, and we eliminate those who are there pre-trial simply because they don't have the bail money, we actually get down to a small enough number, significantly small enough number, that the ones left could be placed in other facilities without having to build any new jails. Mm-hmm. So the numbers actually all add up to do this without building new jails. And in fact, the only reason that it would even make sense to build new jails is if you start following the money and seeing how real estate has invested in some of our political leaders. Just being honest, because otherwise it does not make sense. It's literally building more prisons to try to stop a problem of mass incarceration.
Right. That doesn't, yeah.
It doesn't add up. It does not add up. And it doesn't make sense numbers wise in terms of those who are incarcerated either. But like I said, it does make sense if you start following the dollars and cents and seeing the way that folks are invested and how real estate is way too tied up in people's political campaigns.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Rikers, I think Rikers is a really sort of, at least in New York City, is such a well-known example of that, but I think that's probably the case if you were to examine other, other prisons. It would be a very, very similar situation, would be my guess. For the majority of the people there, I think the belief is that they're there because they committed some kind of violent crime, right? So people think that when you're a really violent person, you go to jail and then you serve your time, and then everybody's there is sort of deserving of being there, or something happened in that case that required them to be there. But it's actually, a lot of it is many people can't afford bail and they're sitting there literally just waiting.
Exactly.
Which it's actually a huge percentage of people too, which most people don't know.
Yeah, it is. And then we wind up with cases like the Khalif Browder case, where, where it's like you have someone who like literally never went to trial, just in Rikers for years.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I wanted to sort of make a little bit of a transition to ask you about local politics in Harlem specifically. And what I wanted to talk about was, I know that historically, our district has had fairly low voter turnout. I think you mentioned it was 10% when we spoke. So we sort of touched upon this in terms of there seems to be a lot more political engagement now, right, given everything that's happening. But, I guess, why do you think people have not engaged politically? Why has Harlem not engaged politically in the past, would you say? What are some of the reasons for that, do you think?
Well, I think to be honest, when people get so beaten down, when you are of a community and there's literally just layers and layers of oppression. I mean, Harlem has been oppressed for a long time. I talk about this in my speeches. We've had literally billions and billions of dollars have been stolen from Harlem. Mm-hmm. Every time there's a chance to zone in a way that hurts us, it's done. It's done in a way that's different from other communities of Black and brown people because we're in Manhattan. It's done, it has been done very intentionally. The community has been very disempowered. We have some of the highest incarceration rates. We have some of the highest poverty rates. We have a lot of issues when it comes to education and access. And so I think you have a large part of our community that is very discouraged and very beaten down and very disheartened and just not believing that the change is possible or that anything can really happen. And so they're not engaged across the board because they don't think the change is possible. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of history. And I guess that's the flip side, because I love to talk about Harlem history, and I will toot the horn all day about how we've had amazing liberation struggles and great freedom fighters and huge leaders and just awesome folks that have come from this place, including James Baldwin, who recently celebrated the birthday, right? We recently commemorated what would be his 95th. But even James Baldwin in talking about freedom and fighting in politics was discouraging, especially towards the end. If you read some of the writing, I mean, it was really, people really got to sort of this place of hopelessness. And I think some of that still lingers, some of that taste and some of that lack of freedom, the dream constantly deferred, right? Like that is still lingering here. And I think the other piece is a pragmatism from especially older Black people that I personally am so frustrated with. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to work on it because I understand where it comes from. I do. I get where it comes from, but and it's something that I grew up with too, because my great aunt was like that, and even at times my parents are like that. There's this pragmatism in, I think, older Black adults where they even see the vision and they even agree with the vision and they even want the change, but they don't believe it's possible. They just think, oh, you have to be politically pragmatic and there's no way to do the things you're saying. And I think that's unfortunate and becomes a little discouraging to those of us who are younger and want to see change. And it's just frustrating because if we all want to actually see change, then let's just start doing it. Let's literally just do it. Just start making the changes and have the bold views and let the outside world shut us out, instead of the cop in our head type deal. Yeah, I think especially among Black people, we have some of that.
Yeah. I think even that was it. The 10% ended up being 20,000 people that turned out, something like that, right? I mean, that's still 20,000 people who are turning out. I mean, obviously, it'd be great if those numbers were up, but I think in terms of the mobilization, when you look at the sheer number of people, right, to be able to engage even more, I mean, the impact that can possibly have, 10% is 20.
Oh, yeah, and that's something we talked about too. And I should say that just to give the hopeful spin on this is that there is a lot of potential for change, because it isn't impossible, right? Like, there are 20,000 people who voted in the last primary for this office. There are 200,000 in the district. So we're at, just about like 10%. It was actually just under 10% who actually voted. And yeah, the downside of that is that I do feel people are disengaged and discouraged. But the upside of that is that I think part of the reason people have felt discouraged is there hasn't been a candidate who has just inspired people enough to go out and vote. Like, just inspired folks enough to say, oh yeah, let me get up and go out and vote. And 20,000 is a lot, but it's not a lot in terms of mobilizing, in terms of what I'm trying to do with disrupting this district. We have a vote goal of 20,000. And that's our intention, to mobilize 20,000 people.
Yeah.
And we're hopeful that a whole bunch of them are going to be new voters, and that's going to be great.
Yeah. No, that's actually a very, very good point. And I think, something that, to your point, everyone wants to be engaged and go out, and especially around what's happening. I think what was sort of in the media at the forefront was the protesting, right? And that was very, very front and center. And I think there are many people who want to participate, and they understand the importance even within Harlem specifically, but maybe don't feel comfortable protesting, which is totally fine. So I was wondering if you had any sort of organizations. I mean, I know that you personally have hosted a lot of virtual and in-person events. You had the Kwanzaa in July teach-in and the March for Black Women as well. But what are some ways, I think, just generally, that residents of Harlem can participate? Maybe organizations that you're aware of, like how, if somebody wants to go out there and they, want to do something, but they don't feel comfortable protesting, what are some things that they can do within our community?
Well, so there are a couple of different things. So I think if community service is really your jam, there's a couple organizations that are doing the work in terms of serving the community, not necessarily political, but just giving back locally, right? One that I've been involved with is Salem Food Pantry, and they just literally serve hundreds of people free food every week. I know that there's also been a ramp up by Food Bank of New York to serve more people as well. I also think that there is an organization, I actually was involved with them for a little bit too, called Invisible Hands, and they have a Harlem chapter or Harlem cadre where you can basically go pick up food from the store and bring it to seniors and those who have autoimmune deficiencies. So that's ways to get involved in terms of service. There is, if you're into kids and art, there's a great organization called Art in the Park that's also Harlem local, and they do great work, and they are working with kids, now socially distanced, but still trying to do events and things for kids in the park, and with an artistic flair. So I think those are some ways to help. One thing I will say is that on my campaign team, there are also ways to help without going out. So if you're somebody who you don't feel safe going outside, or you're unable to go outside, we have an outreach effort where we're actually calling people in the community on a regular basis, and we're checking in and just making sure if anyone needs food, if anyone needs mutual aid assistance, or if people need assistance with housing, we're helping direct folks to the services that they may need. So don't feel like if you go to kristinforharlem.com and sign up, that it's just going to be political. You can also sign up and say, oh, I want to help make calls to the neighborhood just to check on people, because we're doing that too. or you could say, I just want to help serve food, because we're doing that too. You can also sign up to be politically involved. You can also come lobby for the team. But yeah, we're doing a lot of service also.
That's awesome. I think Josh is dropping some links in the chat.
Yeah,
yes, thank you, Josh. So we have, and I also made a note of some of them, and I'm happy to make a list of the organizations that you mentioned, so I can give it out to people. But I mean, it's great. There's a lot going on, and so there's a ton of ways to get involved. Even though, you know, everything that's happening, there's many different ways to still make a difference. So I kind of wanted to, you know, make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask questions. So I guess what I'll do now is, if you guys have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I believe we got one already here. And yeah, so just feel free to, you know, ask any questions that you have. Let me see. Josh, I don't know if we had some other ones, but we have, okay, here we go. So Alia asked, thanks for the great conversation and thanks to the organizers. I know we were speaking about abolition, but would love to hear Kristin's thoughts about her affordable housing platform and how that connects to the goal of reducing crime / police presence in Harlem. Would also love to hear her thoughts on how to balance maintaining affordability of Harlem housing while still being open to newcomers who are committed to not messing it up. She loves that comment from you. Great, good question, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I will say that in terms of affordable housing, I'm for universal rent control and rent stabilization, including commercial rent control. So I actually think more than anything else, it has not to do with new people coming or not coming, but with regulating landlords and developers. Because the game that we play right now very often is, oh, well, I'm old Harlem, you're new Harlem, you're a gentrifier, blah, 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 right? And the only ones winning are the landlords and the developers. And the ones that need to be addressed are the ones that are making money off of all the pain, including the pain of someone who is coming and maybe they are interested in Harlem and they're willing to engage. And I think that's a beautiful thing. But I also want to acknowledge the pain of just lack of affordability to live in other spaces, because that's what we have to understand. What's going on here is that people are not able to afford New York City. New York City is too freaking expensive. And so people are moving to where they can afford, and not intentionally, but like some of that is leading to displacement. But what I have said is that it's not about new folks can't move in. It's just that new folks can't move in at the expense of those who've been here. It's unacceptable to displace people. And when we take the time and we do the work to have rent control, rent stabilization, affordability in the neighborhood, and we keep those around, which is legislative, it is electoral, it has to do with lobbying for our elected officials who are willing to stand up to real estate and developers and are not taking a bunch of campaign money from them and are not in their pockets, that then we will see some of the change, because it's very possible to have a Harlem that has both. Like, it is very possible. In fact, most of the new buildings are on formerly vacant lots. A lot of it is not direct displacement. A lot of it has to do with we haven't regulated landlords to the point where they cannot increase rents.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that question. Kelly asked, is there a link to more information about Art in the Park Kristin mentioned? I believe actually they have an Instagram. I'm happy to link it as well. Art in the Park, I think. Oh, you're muted, Kristin, I think.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, yeah, they're on Insta. I will try to put in, I think they have it with underscore. I'm gonna try to put it in the chat.
Guys, feel free to ask any other questions. We have another one coming in, I believe.
Just check it.
Okay, so hi, thanks so much for this space and this conversation. I'd love to hear more about some of your inspirations in thinking about abolition. And as a follow-up, how is prison abolition something that needs to be embodied and brought into our daily lives? In thinking about the political as personal, are there some ways to think about how we are resolving conflicts, building restorative practices, etc., that can extend to our political call for prison abolition? I love that question. It's a great question. Yes, a lot there.
I'm sorry. I was making sure the Art in the Park link was correct.
Let me read it again. Okay. So I don't know. Let me read it again. So they're essentially asking, what are some of your inspirations in thinking about abolition? And as a follow-up, how is prison abolition something that needs to be embodied and brought into our daily lives? In thinking about the political as personal, are there some ways to think about how we are resolving conflicts, building restorative practices, etc., that can extend to our political call for prison abolition? So I think essentially we have this larger call for abolition on a much larger concept, but how is it that we can embody it even on a micro level, which is like within, interpersonal relationships?
I like this question too.
Thank you, Anonymous.
It's an awesome question, because I think as abolitionists, sometimes we're called to interrogate ourselves and our own actions as well, and figure out, like, if we're going to have this larger call for a lack of state violence, then that means that we need to also look at ourselves, because what we're calling for is no monopoly on violence. And so we need to make sure we're not doing that in our own lives. I think one of the best and strongest things we can do is making sure we're taking care of ourselves and checking in and taking care of other people. So when I said that one of the things that could start tomorrow is community care, I really meant that. Like the actual care of checking in on people, checking in on our neighbors. This is part of why we do this in my campaign, because I do think that one does lead to the other. And the more people feel connected and a sense of community, the greater we've gotten at showing that we are one human family and we are all connected, and that there should be no monopoly on violence, and that we should move towards nonviolence and the world of abolition in general. So I think challenging ourselves to make sure we take that time for self-care, and also, again, community care, where we're reaching out to someone else, even if that's the neighbor, the friend. I also think Cop Watch, again, as a social responsibility, ties directly to abolition in terms of just holding police officers accountable.
Yeah.
I also think making sure we interrogate. I'm not gonna say never call police. I know there are abolitionists who do say that, and I personally am in that place, but I understand that is a hard ask for those we have not given alternatives to, right? So if we have not given an alternative, I don't think it's fair to demand, like, don't call police. But what I will say is, I think as abolitionists, can we make sure we interrogate within ourselves what's going on before we evoke calling police, and address things as much as possible without the use of police. Like, let's us take a crack at it first, right? So first, can you talk to your neighbor about the noise? Or first, can you call a helpline about this person, that you've come across?
Yeah.
Or can you call for resources? Or do you have a neighbor you can reach out to? What can we do to de-escalate situations and not escalate situations, understanding that calling police is escalating a situation, particularly for Black and Brown community?
Yes, There are a couple of other questions that I want to get to, but I know the other part was also, I guess, inspiration, maybe some books or authors that I guess you can recommend. I know bell hooks, obviously.
Yes, yes. My favorite, so one of my favorite books of all time is the anthology, Black Women's Anthology. It is um, edited and it was put together and edited by Toni Cade Bambara, but it has multiple Black female authors in it. And it does include bell hooks. It does include, I think, even some Angela Davis. There's a lot of us in there, and it's a beautiful anthology, and it will give you ideas for who to read next, because you get a lot of different Black female authors, and you can use that as a jumping off point to then say, oh, well, maybe I'll read more of this or more of that. So that I would recommend.
Thank you. All right, so we have two questions, three. I want to make sure we get through all of these. So, hey guys, thank you for this great conversation. Kristin, I am such a fan, along with your thoughts on abolition. I would love to hear more about taking steps towards exonerating exonerating the innocent. It's something I want to get involved in since my father has been wrongly convicted for 11 years now. I know abolition is the long term, and I agree, but what about those who are losing their time now?
Wow, this is such a great and powerful question. Yeah, I have to say, so I, as an activist, I've been involved with the Black Panther Commemoration Committee, and within that, there's this campaign to free them all, meaning all political prisoners, and we still have, believe it or not, former Black Panthers who are imprisoned for simply political reasons, and we do have many who are wrongly incarcerated. I do not have a direct platform point to that yet, but I am inspired to go do that and figure that out. Because I'm not sure exactly what could be done on the city council level, but at the very basic